Welcome to the Vesper. Happy Sabbath. How are you all? I hope you all had a wonderful, wonderful week. Tonight, I pray to the Lord that you be blessed with His love and that you feel the joy of His salvation and His peace while living in this chaotic world. Let us do a little recap before we go into chapter 24 of Exodus. 2 weeks ago, we studied chapter 20, right? The 10 Commandments of God. And last week, we studied chapter 21 to 23, the details and application of God's law. So why laws? Didn't God already promise Abraham that He will bless them and that He will give him a nation? Not only him, his descendants, right? So why are laws necessary? Well, the obvious answer is the law or covenant from God are like compass, right? Intend to guide Israel as they learn to be a holy kingdom of priests, to serve God and to teach other nations of the world about Him. Israel, we call it a theocracy nation, meaning a nation ruled directly by God. The law or the covenant are used interchangeably in the Old Testament. They're given by God to establish Israel's political, social, and religious life. There's another important and interesting observation. Did you notice that the narratives of Exodus 19 and 24 are like bookends? They sandwiched the law of Exodus 20 to 23 in between. In another word, the law or the covenant of God is in the middle of His story of grace and deliverance. It is not all law and it is not all grace. Both together reflect God's character. Grace and deliverance show God's mercy. His laws show that He's just and fair, and He hates sin that is destroying man and His creation. In the previous chapters, especially chapter 20, do you recall the people were very fearful? And after they saw, the thundering, the lightning, the earthquake, on the mountain and God's, awesome voice talking to them. And so they were so frightened that they told Moses that they no longer want to have direct contact with God and asked Moses to be the representative. So let me just read you 2 verses that it shows God was talking to Moses and no longer talking to the people directly. Chapter 20, verse 21. The people remained at a distance while Moses approached the thick darkness where God was. Chapter 21, verse 1, God told Moses, "These are the laws you are to set before them," them meaning the people. So God no longer tells the people directly. So Moses will hear God's instruction and bring back to the people. The people remain at a distance while Moses speaks to the Lord up in the mountain, in the midst of the thick clouds. So now we go to chapter 24, begins with verse 1. Then the Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab, and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel. You are to worship at a distance. But Moses alone is to approach the Lord. The other must not come near, and the people may not come up with him." Now God is concluding His speech to Moses that had begun 3 chapters ago, Exodus chapter 20. While here, God permits Moses to ascend to the top of Mount Sinai, but the 70 elders must worship from a distance, and the rest of the people must remain at the foot of the mountain. Interestingly, this threefold division parallels the way the tabernacle right now it hasn't built yet, but later on, a few chapters down, right? This threefold division parallels the way that the tabernacle is divided into 3 sections with degrees of holiness. And we'll talk more about it when the tabernacle is eventually erected. While the rules about who can enter God's presence on Mount Sinai will prepare Israel for the similar rules regarding the tabernacle. So, question, who are these 70 elders? Well, I think from my observation is that they are Moses' assistants. Back in chapter 18, if you remember, Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, told Moses to choose capable men who were righteous to assist him. So let's read that verse again, okay? So this is Jethro's suggestion. Verse 21 in chapter 18. He said, but select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy, men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you. The simple cases they can decide themselves. That will make your load lighter, because they will share it with you. If you do this, and God so commands, you will be able to stand the strain, and all these people will go home satisfied. So, perhaps these capable men mentioned in chapter 18 are the elders mentioned here in chapter 24. So now, let's go back to chapter 24, begin with verse 3. When Moses went and told the people all the Lord's words and laws, they responded with one voice, everything the Lord has said we will do. Moses then wrote down everything the Lord has said. Well, after God had communicated the 10 commandments directly to his people, the people were afraid, right? We said that. They trembled at God's presence with the fire, earthquake, thundering, and lightning. Therefore, from then onward, they avoid direct contact with God. So the subsequent laws were communicated through Moses. Moses heard God's instruction, and he transcribed all God's word, and then he reads them to the people. Then the Israelites verbally confirmed their commitment to obey God, and they said, everything God said, we will do. After that, Moses proceeds to arrange ceremony for the official agreement of the covenant. And we'll see what this ceremony is about. What is it like? What do they do? So now let's go on to verse 4. He, meaning Moses, got up early the next morning and built an altar at the foot of the mountain and set up 12 stone pillars representing the 12 tribes of Israel. Then he sent young Israelite men, and they offered burnt offerings and sacrificed young bulls as fellowship offering to the Lord. Moses took half of the blood and put it in bowls, and the other half he splashed against the altar. Then he took the book of covenant and read it to the people. They responded, we will do everything the Lord has said. We will obey. Moses then took the blood, sprinkled it on the people, and said, this is the blood of the covenant that the Lord hath made with you in accordance with all these words. In this passage, Moses is setting up a ceremony to formally consent to the covenant that he had written down, which is called the Book of Covenant. Just to make it clear, the Book of Covenant records the laws given by God immediately following the 10 Commandments in chapter 20. The Book of Covenant begins with a short instruction on sacrifices and building altars, and then followed by social and civil law applying to specific situations. and including the treatment of slaves, capital crimes, compensation for personal injuries, etc., etc. If you remember, we talked about it last week, right? Well, what about this passage mentioned that those are 12 stone pillars? Well, these pillars were not objects of worship. God forbids it. These pillars are not gods. They just represent the 12 tribes. So at this point, why do they build an altar, offering bulls and sprinkling of blood? What is the meaning? The building of the altar here and the offering of sacrifices fulfills the instruction given in Exodus chapter 20, 24. Well, God told Moses that when the people build him an altar and offer sacrifice to him, he will be honored by the action and he will come to them. So making covenant with God without God's presence is pointless, right? And the blood? So Moses sealed the covenant by sprinkling sacrifice blood on both the altar and the people. Blood covenant indicates loyalty to the promise made. God made good his promise to the Israelites, and his people promised to be loyal and obedient to God. In the later chapters, we'll see both burnt offerings and fellowship offerings are also necessary to consecrate people. The people offer sacrifice of a bull to invite God's presence, and the sprinkling of blood is to seal the covenant promise between God and his people. I just want to repeat just to make it clear. So we call this covenant the Old Covenant. And later in the New Testament, Jesus' sacrifice replaced the animal sacrifice, and Jesus' blood sealed the new covenant. Can you see how it is related? How that the Old Testament covenant is symbolic for the new covenant in the New Testament. To us modern day Christians, we can understand why the usage of blood, right? The animal blood symbolizes Christ's blood that redeems humanity, and it fulfills the promise God made to Adam and Eve in Genesis 3 and 15. Even though we humans may think we can follow God's law, but in reality, we can never be perfect enough to meet God unless we have Christ's redemptive blood. In a few chapters, we'll observe similar sacrifices used, the ritual for the consecration of Aaron and his sons as priests. Now let's go to verse 9. Moses and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel went up and saw the God of Israel. Under his feet was something like a pavement made of lapis lazuli, as bright blue as the sky. But God did not raise his hand against his leaders of the Israelites. They saw God and they ate and drank. Moses, Aaron, Nadab, Abihu, and the 70 elders of Israel partially ascended and worshipped at a distance, eating and drinking with God in view. The text repeats, they saw God. Saw denotes an intense perception of what is actually there and is true. Not an imagination, not a vision. They actually saw. And the claim that they saw God is surprising because commonly known that no one can see God, right, and live. So why they saw God and live? But then in this passage, we also notice that it said God did not raise his hand against these leaders. Seems like God made an exception for the 74 persons. Also, the text only focuses on what is under God's feet, something like a pavement made of sapphire, clear as the sky itself. And it did not focus on God's face. And the passage said they saw God and they ate and drank. Well, shouldn't they be worshiping instead of eating and drinking? It seems disrespectful, doesn't it? So why? Well, in the ancient time, eating and drinking together was a common way to confirm a covenant. If you remember the story back in Genesis chapter 26, Abimelech ate and drank with Isaac after they made a covenant together not to harm each other. You remember that? So here the people were doing the same, celebrating and confirming a covenant with God. Now verse 12. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction." Then Moses set out with Joshua his aide, and Moses went up on the mountain of God. He said to the elders, "Wait here for us until we come back to you. Aaron and Hur are with you, and anyone involved in a dispute can go to them." This is the first time Joshua is referred to as Moses' assistant. Later on, we'll also see it in chapter 33, and then the book of Joshua, chapter 1. So how about Hur? If you recall, Hur was the one who helped Aaron to hold up Moses' hands during the battle with Amalek. You remember that? Back in chapter 17. So Moses set out with Joshua for some unspecified distance. We don't know how far. They went before Moses left Joshua there, and then Moses went alone to the top of Mount Sinai. Then Moses continued up on the mountain of God to the top for the 5th time, but not the last time. We do not hear about Joshua again until they both come down in chapter 32, verse 17. Well, in their absence, Moses arranged for the smooth administration of justice by appointing Aaron and Hur as the highest court of appeal in place of himself. Even in the midst of a theophany, God's visible display to them, and an intact justice system was an important concern. Over here, I kind of see how human nature is. Even in the midst of meeting God, they still have quarrel, they still have disputes, and they still need judges. So now go on to verse 15. When Moses went up on the mountain, the cloud covered it, and the glory of the Lord settled on Mount Sinai. For 6 days the cloud covered the mountain, and on the 7th day the Lord called to Moses from within the cloud. To the Israelites, the glory of the Lord looked like a consuming fire on top of the mountain. Then Moses entered the cloud as he went up the mountain. And he stayed on the mountain 40 days and 40 nights. So Moses went up the mountain to meet with God. God's presence and glory descended on the mountain. And Moses waited for 6 full days until on the 7th, God finally called from the cloud. And Moses entered into his presence to receive his command. Moses waited 6 days on the mountain, before being called into God's presence. We can't even wait for 6 seconds before picking up our smartphone to fill the silence and awkwardness of having nothing to do to reflect what is in our heart. So, what is the reason having to wait? Well, we, men and women, are worldly. Our hearts are far from understanding spiritual things of God. It takes time, waiting, worshiping, reflecting to know what is inside us. And also, we need time to prepare in worship to receive what is holy from God. So, in summary, what do we observe in this chapter in regard to God's character? Number 1, He is thorough and methodical. Always have our welfare in mind. God knows us so well. His requirements are often for our own good. To help His people to be accountable to their promise or covenant, God requires their public confession and sealing of the covenant with a ceremony. Number 2, also we notice the law or the covenant of God is in the middle of His story of grace and deliverance. So it is not only law, but both law and grace reflect God's character. Grace and deliverance show God's mercy. His law show He's just and fair, and that He hates sin, because sin is destroying mankind and God's creation. 3, God here, I see Him protecting His people by putting them at a distance from Him. Second question, what do we observe here in regard to humanity? Well, we are sinners, obviously, and the relationship between us and God are broken. Even though God has given us the law and instruction, but it is His grace and compassion that saves us and gives us deliverance through trials and hardship. And it is God's blood that seals our relationships. Another thing is that it takes us time to get to know how to be obedient even. The Israelites here, not only the 10 Commandments was given to them, application has to be given to them. And then Moses has to go up to the mountain many more times to receive more instruction for the people. Third question, what does this chapter has to do with our life today? We are all sinners. Our hearts are far from God, and we don't understand spiritual things of God, like Moses, who waited 6 days before speaking to God. We too need to take time to recognize what is in our heart and our need of Him. Repent and ask for His grace and mercy. And this is our preparation to meeting Him. Happy Sabbath.